Hamlet summary and analysis of Act 1. Summary. Scene 1. The play opens during a bitterly cold night watch outside of the royal Danish palace. There is a change in the guards. Bernardo replaces Francisco. Soon characters arrive, Horatio and Marcellus. We learn that Bernardo and Marcellus, two soldiers, have witnessed an extraordinary sight on both of the previous night's watches. The ghost of the former king of Denmark, old Hamlet, has appeared before them in full armor. On this third night, they've welcomed Horatio, a scholar and a skeptic who has just arrived in Denmark, to verify their ghost sighting. Horatio initially expresses doubt that the ghost will appear. Suddenly, it does. The two soldiers charge Horatio to speak to the ghost, but he does not. The ghost disappears just as suddenly as it arrived. Soon after the ghost's disappearance, Marcellus asks the other two why there has been such a massive mobilization of Danish war forces recently. Horatio answers, saying that the Danish army is preparing for a possible invasion by Fortinbras, Prince of Norway. We learn that Fortinbras' father was killed many years before in single combat with old Hamlet, the now deceased king whose ghost we have just seen. Now that old Hamlet has died, presumably weakening the Danes, there is a rumor that Fortinbras plans to invade Denmark and claim that lands that were forfeit after his father's death. After Horatio has finished explaining this political backstory, the ghost of old Hamlet appears once more. This time Horatio does try to speak to the ghost. When the ghost remains silent, Horatio tells Marcellus and Bernardo to try to detain it. They strike at the ghost with their spears but jab only air. A rooster crows just as the ghost appears ready to reply to Horatio at last. This sound startles the ghost away. Horatio decides to tell Prince Hamlet, old Hamlet's son, about the apparition, and the others agree. Scene 2. This scene begins at the court of Claudius and Gertrude, the king and queen of Denmark. They have just been married. This marriage has followed quickly after the death of the former king of Denmark, old Hamlet, Claudius' brother. Claudius addresses the quickness of the marriage, representing himself as in mourning for a lost brother even as he is joyful for a new wife, his one-time sister. Claudius also addresses the question of the young Fortinbras' proposed invasion. He says that he has spoken to Fortinbras' uncle, the king of Norway, who has made Fortinbras promise to halt any plans to invade Denmark. Claudius sends Cornelius and Voltmand, two courtiers, to Norway to settle this business. Finally, Claudius turns to Laertes, the son of his trusted counselor, Polonius. Laertes expresses a wish to return to France and Claudius grants permission. At this point, Prince Hamlet, who has been standing apart from the king's audience this whole time, speaks the first of his many lines. Claudius asks Hamlet why he is still so gloomy. Hamlet's replies are evasive, cynical, and punning. He declares that his grief upon losing his father still deeply affects him. Claudius goes into a speech about the unnaturalness of prolonged grief. To lose one's father is painful but common, he says, and Hamlet should accept this as nature's course. He expresses a wish that Hamlet remain with them in Denmark instead of returning to Wittenberg, where he is a student, and when Gertrude seconds this wish, Hamlet agrees. The king, queen, and all their retinue then exit the stage, leaving Hamlet alone. In his first soliloquy, Hamlet expresses the depths of his melancholy and his disgust at his mother's hastily marrying Claudius after the death of his father. He declares his father to be many times Claudius' superior as a man. After this soliloquy, Horatio, Marcellus, and Bernardo enter. At first, Hamlet is too aggrieved to recognize Horatio, his old-school friend, but finally he welcomes Horatio warmly. After chatting about the state, Horatio tells Hamlet that he has seen his dead father recently the night before. Hamlet asks him to explain, and Horatio tells the story of the appearance of the ghost. Hamlet decides to attend the watch that very night in hopes of seeing the ghost himself. Scene 3. As the scene opens, Laertes is taking his leave of his sister Ophelia. In the course of their farewells, Laertes advises her about her relationship with Hamlet, with whom she has been spending much of her time lately. He tells her to forget him because he, as Prince of Denmark, is too much to hope for as a husband. He adds that she should vigilantly guard her chastity, her most prized treasure as a woman. Ophelia agrees to attend to his lesson. As Laertes is about to leave, his father, Polonius, arrives. Polonius gives Laertes a blessing and a battery of advice before sending his son on his way. With Laertes gone, Polonius asks Ophelia what they had been talking about as he arrived. Ophelia confesses that they had been talking about her relationship with Hamlet. She tells Polonius that Hamlet has made many honorable declarations of love to her. Polonius pooh-poohs these declarations, saying, much as Laertes did, that Hamlet wants nothing more than to assail her chastity and then leave her. He makes his daughter promise that she will spend no more time alone with Hamlet. Ophelia says that she will obey. Scene 4. At the night watch, Hamlet, Horatio and Marcellus await the reappearance of the ghost. They hear cannons from the castle and Hamlet tells them that this is a sign that Claudius is drinking pledges. Hamlet goes on a short tirade against the Danish custom of drinking heavily. His speech is no sooner over than the ghost appears again. Hamlet immediately addresses the ghost, imploring it to speak. The ghost beckons for Hamlet to come away, apart from the others. Horatio and Marcellus attempt to keep Hamlet from following the ghost, warning him of the many evils that might befall him. Hamlet doesn't listen. He threatens to kill Horatio or Marcellus if they detain him, and when they stay back he follows the ghost off stage. Horatio and Marcellus determine to follow at a distance to make sure that no harm comes to their friend. Scene 5. Alone with Hamlet, the ghost finally speaks. He tells Hamlet that he has come on a nightly walk from purgatory, where his soul is under continual torment for the sins of his life. The ghost then reveals that he was not killed by a viper, as officially announced, but was murdered. Moreover, he reveals that his own brother, Claudius, who now wears his crown and sleeps with his wife, was the murderer. The ghost tells of how Claudius snuck into his garden while he was taking his accustomed afternoon nap and poured poison into his ear, killing him most painfully and sending his soul unpurified into the afterlife. The ghost demands vengeance, telling Hamlet not to plot against his mother, whom he describes as merely weak and lustful, but to focus the whole of his revenge on Claudius. The ghost then disappears. Hamlet, overwhelmed and half-raving, swears that he will kill Claudius. After he has made this vow, Horatio and Marcellus arrive. Hamlet does not tell them what the ghost has revealed, but nevertheless insists that they swear not to speak of the apparition to anyone. They agree. Hamlet then insists that they swear again on his sword. They agree again, confused at these demands. The ghost of old Hamlet, meanwhile, can be heard under the stage, insisting along with his son that they swear themselves to secrecy. Hamlet leads his friends to several different points on stage, insisting that they swear over and over again. He then reveals, parenthetically, that they might find his behavior in the next while to be strange. He might pretend to be mad and act otherwise unusually, but that they must still keep secret what they have seen. After this final agreement, Hamlet leads the others off stage, uneasily determined to revenge his father's murder. Analysis. Even if this is your first time reading Hamlet, it must already seem very familiar. Countless characters, ideas, and quotations introduced in this play have become part of the cultural vocabulary of the Western world and, indeed, the whole world. Many of the most famous critical minds of Western history, from Samuel Johnson to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, from Eliot to Empson, from Voltaire to Goethe to Freud, have taken a crack at the play, and together they have left very few stones unturned. Nevertheless, there is still much to be gained from an intelligent appreciation of Hamlet. While one should not expect to resolve any of the famous and bizarre conundrums of the play, is Hamlet really insane or faking insanity? Did Ophelia commit suicide or not? Is Hamlet in love with his mother? There is still great value in knowing what these conundrums are, how they are presented, and why they are important. Sensitively and cleverly acknowledging a puzzle to be a puzzle is where much Hamlet scholarship begins and ends. The first scene of the play, like most every scene of the play, is very well known and very puzzling. Without explaining his reasons in detail, T.S. Eliot once declared the first lines of the play to be the best lines in English. He and many other critics have found this scene to be a microcosm of the whole play, as it were. Shakespeare uses many deceptively simple rhetorical tricks to introduce some of the major themes and concerns that he follows through to the play's end. For example, in a play that contains many of the most famous, most unanswerable questions ever expressed, whether literal questions or interpretive questions of motivation, it is remarkable that Shakespeare begins Hamlet with a question, "Who's there?" Who's there, indeed? On one level, this is a simple question, one that is asked every day in the most innocuous contexts. But on a deeper level, it is one of the basic questions of philosophy. Who is there? Who are we? What is man? Who is Hamlet? What is Hamlet? In this most philosophical of plays, we begin with a moment of covert philosophy, a question simple on the surface, but profound when pressed, and the first scene continues this focus on questioning, giving us question after question. Horatio, the quintessential scholar, skeptical and empirical, begins by questioning the reality of the ghost. Eventually, he is exhorted to question the ghost in a more literal way, to ask the ghost questions. In general, then, the first scene takes us from the no-nonsense world outside the theater, the world of Horatio and his doubts, to the magical, metaphysical, ultra-theatrical world of Hamlet. We may bring certainties to the play, but we are encouraged almost immediately to abandon them. Thus, before we have even seen Hamlet, we are deeply mired in the play's dubious, spectral atmosphere. In the second scene, after several long speeches by Claudius giving us political background, we come to Hamlet's first soliloquy. A soliloquy is a speech given by a speaker alone on stage, exploring his or her own thoughts and feelings. Both Hamlet and Hamlet are practically synonymous with such speeches. In this play, Shakespeare exhausts the possibilities of such on-stage introspection. Hamlet's soliloquies are not to be thought of as actually happening in any realistic way. Rather, they are moments of suspended time in which the overwhelming pressure of a single thought, or group of thoughts, forces its way out of a speaker's mind by way of his mouth. They are moments where we, as audience members, can enter intimately into Hamlet's mind, exploring the patterns of his thought even as he does so himself. We might notice right away, in this first soliloquy, how difficult Hamlet can be to follow, how much his speech jumps and roils around, allowing interjections, playing with allusions and puns, becoming frequently sidetracked by this or that image. This tendency of Hamlet's, to become sidetracked by his own train of thoughts, is crucial to the play, and crucial to the central motivational mystery of Hamlet, the delay of the revenge. But we will see much more of that to come. We might also note that in his first soliloquy Hamlet appears deeply depressed, as we would put it today, or melancholic, as the people of the early 17th century would have put it. The audience of Hamlet's own day would have expected as much. The play belongs to a genre known as revenge tragedy. Such plays occupied many of the greatest playwrights of the generation directly preceding Shakespeare's, including Thomas Kyd, but by the time Hamlet was written they had come to be seen as rather old-fashioned. Like any genre, revenge tragedy has certain predictable conventions, one of which is that the protagonist of the play is melancholic, dominated by saturnine, sluggish, pensive humors, or bodily spirits. In Hamlet, Shakespeare, rather than simply repeating this convention, explores it as a convention. That is, he gives us the archetypal revenge hero, the most introspective, most melancholic, most pensive hero ever seen on the English stage. At the same time, Hamlet seems somewhat aware that he is, in fact, playing a role on stage. He notices his own costume and makeup. He refers to specific areas in the theater, as when he notes that the ghost is in the cellarage, i.e., v.150. In short, he seems at once to be the most typical of types, and to be an audience to his own typecasting, and furthermore, he seems to be distressed about being so typecast, and anxious to prove that there is something genuine behind his theatrical veneer. In general, critics have long noticed that Hamlet is a play about plays, most specifically a revenge tragedy about revenge tragedy, and the pretzel-like self-referentiality of the protagonist is the main reason why. As a relatively light-hearted accompaniment to such ghastliness and introspective misery, Act 1 features 2 appearances by Polonius and his family. Nearly every Elizabethan play has at least one so-called subplot, and this family occupies the primary subplot of Hamlet, the question of Hamlet's relationship with Ophelia. Polonius, you might have noticed already, is long-winded, pedantic, and meddlesome even while he is somewhat lovable in his fussy way. He is always interested in being in the know, whatever the occasion. Notice, for instance, how eagerly he questions Ophelia about her earlier conversation with Laertes. Act 1 contains Polonius' most famous speech in the play, and one of the most quoted speeches of Shakespeare, the advice speech to Laertes that ends, "To thine own self be true." One can weigh the various maxims here offered on the basis of their individual merits. However, it is a common mistake of new readers of Shakespeare to take this speech simply at face value, to think, in effect, that Shakespeare, not Polonius, is giving this advice. This is never the case in Shakespeare. He never simply speaks through a character, and most certainly not the case here. Notice, for instance, that Polonius' speech begins by telling Laertes to rush off to catch his boat, and then detains him from doing just that. Notice also, that Polonius begins by declaring that he will offer Laertes a few precepts, then goes on to ramble for 30 lines. Polonius, in short, never misses an occasion for a speech, and follows his own advice creatively if at all. His meddlesome, didactic character leads to his undoing, as we shall see. Hamlet summary and analysis of Act 2. Summary. Scene 1. Act 2 begins with Polonius speaking to one of his servants, Reynaldo, about his son, Laertes, who has by this time returned to Paris. We see Polonius in the act of sending Reynaldo after Laertes to inquire into his son's conduct. He instructs Reynaldo very precisely in the method of obtaining this information. First, Reynaldo is to find out from strangers in Paris about the prominent Danes in the city without revealing that he has any particular attachment to Laertes. When Laertes' name comes up, Reynaldo is to pretend to have some distant knowledge of him, and is further to suggest that he knows of Laertes as something of a happy-go-lucky youth given to gambling, drinking, fencing, swearing, fighting, and whoring. By this path of insinuation, Polonius explains, Reynaldo will hear from his hypothetical Parisian interlocutor the unvarnished truth about Laertes' conduct in France. Having thus prepared Reynaldo to spy on his son, Polonius sends him off. Ophelia enters, distraught. She tells her father that Hamlet has frightened her with his wild, unkempt appearance and deranged manners. After Ophelia describes Hamlet's behavior, she further reveals that, as per Polonius' orders, she has cut off all contact with Hamlet and has refused his letters. Polonius reasons, thus, that Hamlet's madness is the result of Ophelia's rejection. He had thought that Hamlet was only trifling with her, but it turns out that Hamlet was indeed deeply in love with Ophelia. Polonius hurries off to tell Claudius and Gertrude that he has discovered the reason for their son's odd behavior. Scene 2. King Claudius has made plans of his own to discover the reasons for Hamlet's supposed madness. He has summoned two of Hamlet's school friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, both to comfort his nephew-cum-son and to try to discover the reason for his distemper. The two scholars are only too happy to oblige in this task. After Rosencrantz and Guildenstern leave the royal presence, Polonius rushes in, announcing that he has found the reason for Hamlet's madness. Before he reveals his news, however, he entreats Claudius and Gertrude to hear from the two ambassadors to Norway, Voltmand and Cornelius, who have just returned. They report that the King of Norway, after looking into his nephew Fortinbras's actions, found out that he was indeed planning to invade Denmark. The King of Norway then rebuked Fortinbras and ordered him to abandon his plan of Danish conquest, which young Fortinbras agreed to do. Overjoyed at his nephew's acquiescence, Norway then rewarded Fortinbras with a generous annual allowance. Further, Norway granted Fortinbras leave to levy war against the Polish. Finally, the ambassadors report that Norway seeks Claudius' permission to allow Fortinbras passage through Denmark in this proposed campaign against Poland. Claudius declares his approval of this message and says that he will consider its details anon. Polonius steps forward to reveal his discovery. He tells the king and queen, in a very roundabout way, that he has discovered Hamlet's foiled love of Ophelia, and that he believes this lost love to be the root cause of Hamlet's madness. Claudius asks how they might prove this to be the case. Polonius has a plan. He offers to loose Ophelia on Hamlet while he is reading alone in the library. Meanwhile, he suggests, he and Claudius could hide behind a tapestry and observe the meeting. Claudius agrees. Just then, Hamlet enters, reading. Gertrude and Claudius exit while Polonius attempts to speak to Hamlet. Hamlet plays with Polonius, mocking him, evading his questions, and turning his language inside out. Nevertheless, Polonius reads between the lines, as it were, and interprets Hamlet's nonsensical replies as motivated by a broken heart. Polonius leaves to contrive the proposed meeting between Hamlet and his daughter. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern enter, surprising their friend Hamlet. The three friends banter philosophically for a good while before Hamlet asks the two why they have come to Elsinore. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern try to dodge this question, declaring that they have come for no other reason than to visit him. Hamlet, though, won't let them off the hook, and makes them admit that the king and queen sent for them. When they admit it, Hamlet also tells them why they were sent for, because he has been deeply melancholy, and has foregone his accustomed behavior. He sinks deeply into a speech detailing this misery. Rosencrantz changes the subject. He tells Hamlet that he and Guildenstern passed a troupe of players on their way to Elsinore. They gossip briefly about the city theaters the troupe had left before coming to Denmark. Soon the players arrive with a flourish. Polonius rushes back into the scene, bearing the already stale news that the players have arrived. Hamlet banters with Polonius in the same mocking vein as before until the players burst into court, at which point Hamlet rushes up to welcome them. Hamlet insists upon hearing a speech straight away, and in particular requests a recitation based on a scene in Virgil's Aeneid, as related by Aeneas to Dido, recounting the death of Priam during the fall of Troy. Hamlet himself begins the speech and then cedes the floor to one of the players, who recites a long and fustian description of Priam's death by Pyrrhus' hand. The player goes on to speak of the wild grief of Hecuba, Priam's wife, after her husband has been killed. While speaking of her agony, the player begins to weep and shake. Polonius finally cuts him off and Hamlet agrees. Before the players retire, however, Hamlet pulls the main player aside and asks him whether the company knows a certain play, The Murder of Gonzago. The player says that they do, and Hamlet commissions it for the following night, saying that he will write some speeches of his own to be inserted into the play as written. The player says that this would be fine and then takes his leave. Left alone on stage, Hamlet muses about the strangeness of his situation. He asks himself, how can this player be so filled with grief and rage over Priam and Hecuba, imaginary figures whom he doesn't even know, while I, who have every reason to rage and grieve and seek bloody revenge, am weak, uncertain, and incapable of action? He curses himself and his indecisiveness before cursing his murderous uncle in a rage. Having regained composure, Hamlet announces his plan to make sure that the ghost of his father is genuine, that the apparition was not some evil spirit sent to lure his soul to damnation. He declares his intention to stage a play exactly based on the murder of his father. While it is played, he will observe Claudius. If the king is guilty, Hamlet figures, surely he will show this guilt when faced with the scene of the crime. Analysis. This act begins by establishing the atmosphere of political intrigue at Elsinore. Polonius plots to spy on Laertes by means of Reynaldo, Claudius and Gertrude plot to spy on Hamlet by means of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Norway foils Fortinbras' plot to invade Denmark, only to assist him in a venture against Poland. It seems that everyone in Elsinore is plotting against everyone else. Significantly, though, these intrigues are represented as very clumsy, if not stupid. Polonius' instructions to Reynaldo are so comically complex and so circuitously related that he himself loses track of them at one point. And his attempt to relate his great discovery of Hamlet's broken heart to Claudius and Gertrude in the second scene does not go any better. Brevity is the soul of wit, he says, and he then proceeds to be anything but brief, anything but witty. Rather, he is dull, pedantic, self-important, pompous, flowery, and, more to the point, dead wrong. As in Act 1, Polonius obviously fancies himself a great political mind. We might beg to differ. Claudius, too, shows remarkable political stupidity in trusting to the espionage of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, two rather clownish fellows whom Hamlet sees through instantly. Moreover, the Norway episode reveals Claudius' blunt instincts quite clearly. He appears ready to agree to allow Fortinbras, whom only days before had planned to take over his realm, to march through Denmark on his way to conquer Poland. This is sort of like allowing Canada to march through the United States in order to attack Mexico. In other words, it makes no sense at all, strategically or logistically. Claudius and Polonius, try as they might to play the part of Machiavellian lords of state, are really quite out of their depth. Hamlet, however, has found his element in Act 2. His language is dazzling, full of wild puns, inventive jokes, and succinct and strong observations sheer mastery. His repartee with Polonius, for instance, plays brilliantly with the notion of method in madness. He plays the role of the melancholic madman almost as though Polonius is a gullible audience member. Hamlet toys with Polonius, leading the old fool to think just what he wants. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, too, are no match for the perceptiveness of Hamlet. He instantly plumbs the depths of their purpose, calling them out for royal spies. In short, Hamlet appears in this act as the only truly gifted politician, the only accurate reader of men's minds, in the whole of Elsinore. Why, then, is he so reluctant to act, so incapable, it seems, of action? Why does he not even mention revenge until the very last speech of the act? It seems that Hamlet is so obsessed with contemplating the meaning of action that he is rendered unable to act himself. This is the central question of Hamlet, of course, and one that has frustrated and intrigued readers for centuries. The transition from the Hamlet of Act 1 Scene 5, so willing and eager to kill Claudius, to the Hamlet of Act 2 Scene 2, where he is witty and evasive and ultimately impotent, is really quite absurd. It's almost as though we've suddenly landed in another play, one not about revenge, but about something else, about madness or politics or about the very meaning of acting. This theme comes to a head, of course, with the appearance of the troupe of players. The handling of the players in Hamlet places the play firmly in the genre of metatheatre, or theatre about theatre. The scenes with the players are full of in-jokes about theatrical happenings in Shakespeare's own day, the rise in popularity of boy acting troupes, for instance. In another winking moment in Act 3, Polonius declares that he was an actor in his younger days. "I did enact Julius Caesar," he says. "I was killed ith capital. Brutus skilled." In fact, scholars surmise Shakespeare staged Hamlet immediately following his own Julius Caesar. Here are two moments among many, then, where Shakespeare refers outside of the play, to the reality of London stage culture. What is he up to with these references? Are they simply jokes, or do they point to some deeper concerns? It seems that Shakespeare is blurring the lines between theatricality and reality. He insists that we see his play as occurring at the same time in the fantasy world of Elsinore and in the actual world of the Globe Theatre in London in the early 17th century. He writes elsewhere, in As You Like It, "All the world's a stage." In Hamlet, he takes this notion a step farther, giving us a play that presses relentlessly on the primordial relationship between acting in the theater and acting in real life. Is there ever a moment when we, as human beings, are not playing a role in one way or another? Are the tears that we shed for the loss of our loved ones any more genuine than the tears that an actor sheds for the imaginary death of Priam, the imaginary grief of Hecuba? If so, how? Why? And this, of course, is the subject of Hamlet's second soliloquy, which closes the act. What's Hecuba to him or he to her? He asks of the player who has just wept for his fictional subject. Shakespeare has layered this speech so carefully and so vertiginously that it might be helpful simply to bracket out the several planes of meaning on which it operates. First, Hamlet speaks of the man on stage who has shown such an outpouring of emotion for Hecuba while he, Hamlet, who has every reason to show such grief himself, remains cold and reluctant to act. But on another level, Hamlet himself is an actor on stage, and has no more reason to wail and grieve and gnash his teeth than the player who spoke of Hecuba does. While he is philosophizing about the nature of pretend grief versus real grief, all is ultimately pretend. There is no Hamlet. There was no poisoning, not really. On this second level, it seems almost as though Hamlet knows that he is in a play. He does not hurry along the revenge because he knows there is nothing really to revenge, nothing really happened, it has all been staged. Of course, he can't really know this, but Shakespeare creates the effect of self-awareness and self-doubt that reaches beyond the limitations of the stage. Somehow he is able to explore these philosophical questions while maintaining a compelling plotline. By the way, this notion of Hamlet as meta-theater is explored, among several other places, in Lionel Abel's book, Tragedy and Meta-Theater, Essays on Dramatic Form. Hamlet Summary and Analysis of Act 3 Summary Scene 1 An entourage consisting of the king and queen, Polonius and Ophelia, and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern enters to begin the act. Claudius asks Rosencrantz and Guildenstern what they have learned about Hamlet's malady. The two reply that they have not been able to find its cause. They do mention, however, that Hamlet was very enthusiastic about the player's performance that night, which prompts Claudius to agree to attend the play. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern leave. Polonius and Claudius then begin their plan to loose Ophelia on Hamlet and mark their encounter, hoping to find the root of his madness. They instruct Ophelia to pretend that she is simply reading a book and withdraw behind a tapestry. Hamlet enters and delivers the most famous speech in literature, beginning, "To be or not to be." After this long meditation on the nature of being and death, Hamlet catches sight of Ophelia. After a short conversation she attempts to return some of the remembrances that Hamlet gave when courting her. Hamlet replies caustically, questioning Ophelia's honesty. He then berates Ophelia, telling her off sarcastically and venomously, with the refrain, "Get thee to a nunnery," or in other words, "Go become a nun to control your lust." After this tirade, Hamlet exists, leaving Ophelia in shambles. Claudius and Polonius step out of their hiding place. The king states that he does not believe that Hamlet is mad because of his foiled love for Ophelia, or really mad at all, but tormented for some hidden reason. He determines to send Hamlet on a diplomatic mission to England before he can cause any serious trouble. Polonius endorses this plan, but persists in his belief that Hamlet's grief is the result of his love for Ophelia. He consoles his daughter. Polonius suggests in parting that Claudius arrange a private interview between Hamlet and his mother after the play that evening, and Claudius agrees. Scene 2 Just as the play is about to begin, Hamlet instructs the players on the art of acting, telling them to act naturally and to avoid bombast. He sets the players to their preparations and then conferences with Horatio. After complimenting Horatio in the most sterling terms, Hamlet asks his friend to assist him in watching the king's response to the play they are about to see. Horatio seats himself so as to view the king properly. The royal entourage enters. Hamlet manically chatters with Claudius, Polonius, Gertrude and Ophelia, reserving special attention for the latter, whom he sits next to and teases. The play begins with a dumb show, which is a pantomime of the drama to come. On stage, the basic form of the alleged murder is repeated. A king and queen are shown happily married, the king takes a nap, a poisoner enters and pours something in the king's ear, killing him. The poisoner then takes possession of the queen. Ophelia seems confused by this plot, but Hamlet tells her to wait for the speaker of the prologue to explain. The prologue is a short little jingling rhyme. The player king and queen then immediately enter the stage. The king mentions that they have been married 30 years. The player queen expresses a hope that their love lasts as long over again. The king encourages the queen to remarry if he dies. The queen protests against this notion vehemently, swearing never to love another if or does she turn widow. With this, the king falls asleep and the queen exits. Hamlet asks his mother, Gertrude, how she likes the play, and Gertrude replies with the famous line, "The lady doth protest too much, methinks." Claudius is also outspokenly apprehensive about the nature of the play. It continues, however, with the entrance of Lucianus, the sleeping king's nephew. This evil character creeps up to the sleeping player king and pours poison in his ear. Hamlet, unable to contain himself, erupts, telling everyone that Lucianus will soon win the love of the king's over-protesting wife. At this, Claudius rises and orders the play to end. He retreats with his retinue. Hamlet and Horatio laugh together, certain now that the ghost was telling the truth. After a short celebration, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern enter and tell Hamlet that he has made Claudius very angry. They also say that Gertrude has ordered Hamlet to meet her in her chamber. They then entreat Hamlet to tell the cause of his distemper. Hamlet replies mockingly by saying that they are trying to play him like a pipe and that he won't let them. Polonius enters and entreats Hamlet again to see his mother. All exit but Hamlet. In a short soliloquy, Hamlet reflects that he will be cruel to his mother, showing her the extent of her crime in marrying Claudius, but will not actually hurt her. Scene 3. Claudius gives Rosencrantz and Guildenstern a sealed envelope with orders to convey Hamlet to England and give the envelope to the king there. In highly flattering terms, they agree to do the king's bidding and exit. Polonius then enters, saying that Hamlet is going to meet with his mother, and declaring his intention to hide behind an arras and listen to their conversation. He exits. Alone, the king looks into his soul. He is deeply disgusted by what he sees. He kneels to pray, hoping to purge his guilt, but reflects that this penance will not be genuine because he will still retain the prizes for which he committed murder in the first place, his crown and his wife. As Claudius is vainly attempting to pray, Hamlet comes up behind him. He reflects that he now has an opportunity to kill his uncle and revenge his father, but pauses, considering that because Claudius is in the act of prayer he would likely go straight to heaven if killed. Hamlet resolves to kill Claudius later, when he is in the middle of some sinful act. He continues on to his mother's chamber. Scene 4. In the chamber, awaiting Hamlet's arrival, Polonius hides himself behind one of Gertrude's curtains. Hamlet enters. Gertrude attempts to be firm and chastising, but Hamlet comes right back at her, saying that she has sinned mightily in marrying her husband's brother. He pulls his mother in front of a mirror, saying that he will reveal her inmost part, and Gertrude momentarily misinterprets this, thinking that Hamlet may attempt to murder her. She cries for help. Polonius, hidden from view, also cries out for help. Hamlet thinks that the hidden voice belongs to Claudius. He stabs Polonius through the curtain, killing him. When he sees that he has killed Polonius, Hamlet declares the old man to be a rash, intruding fool. Quickly forgetting about this death, Hamlet seats his mother down and presents her with two portraits, one of her first husband and the other of Claudius. He describes the two as opposites, the one all nobility and virtue, the other all deformity and vice. Gertrude is deeply affected by this comparison and seems to comprehend the enormity of her sin. Hamlet continues to berate her and describe Claudius in the most foul and hurtful language. While in the middle of this harangue, old Hamlet's ghost appears once more, telling Hamlet to stop torturing his mother and to remember his duty to kill Claudius. At the ghost's command, Hamlet consoles his mother. Gertrude, unable to see the ghost, sees Hamlet talking to thin air and resolves that he is indeed insane. The ghost exits. Hamlet tells his mother that he is not in fact insane. He reiterates that she should repent her marriage to Claudius and tells her in particular to stay away from their shared bed for the night. After describing the importance of this abstinence in the most colorful terms, Hamlet reminds his mother that he is ordered to England. Hamlet says that although he will go to England, he will not trust Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He exits his mother's bedroom, dragging the body of Polonius behind him. Analysis on of the most remarkable things about the speech that begins, "To be or not to be," the most famous speech in Western literature, is how out of place, how offhand it seems in the larger context of the play. Hamlet has, only a few lines before, hit upon the play as his means of exposing the king. Why, then, is he suddenly contemplating suicide? This psychological strangeness is true, at least, of the version of the play that most of us read, which is a conflation of two Renaissance texts, as explained in the additional content section. In these longer, more literary versions of Hamlet, to be or not to be arrives as a surprise. It slows down the action just as the action is really beginning to move. This odd, out-of-place effect of the speech is a testament to Hamlet's tendency to become wrapped up in his own thoughts, regardless of his surroundings. In the middle of the urgent business of revenge, Hamlet takes the time to explore the nature of death and human life with a subtlety and eloquence that renders the speech unforgettable. Think of his brain as a sort of obsessive problem-solving machine, a focused, powerful instrument that exhausts one subject and then another indiscriminately in short-term bursts, now theater, now death, now sex, now filial duty, and that can only with great difficulty focus on a longer-term plan, such as, "I must kill Claudius." So what is to be or not to be about, anyway? This is an enormous question. Entire books have been written on the speech, most recently Douglas Brester's To Be or Not to Be, and critical consensus as to its nature is far from settled. Most casual readers of Hamlet take the speech to be, at its simplest level, a contemplation of suicide. Hamlet is saying, in effect, wouldn't it be nice to die? We don't know what to expect after death, though, and so that keeps us alive. We would rather suffer the woes we know, painful as they are, than go on to possible woes we cannot conceive of. But of whom is he speaking? Himself, or human beings in general? In other words, the speech can be thought of as a general contemplation of the human condition rather than a specific expression of a desire to die. In an interview in The Atlantic Monthly, the famous Shakespearean Harold Bloom offers an idiosyncratic reading of the speech along the latter lines. It is a testimony, indeed, to the power of the mind over a universe of death, symbolized by the sea, which is the great hidden metaphor. You can read more about this interpretation in his book, Hamlet, Poem Unlimited. This speech, which is really tangential to the action, threatens to dominate most readings of Act 3. But there are many more interesting exchanges and famous scenes in the act. The play within a play, for instance, is the culmination of the theme of theatricality that we've already looked at in Act 2. The play within a play, like other features of Hamlet, is a convention found in several revenge tragedies, including the Spanish tragedy and Shakespeare's own early tragedy, Titus Andronicus. In Hamlet, naturally, Shakespeare takes this convention to its extreme. Hamlet seems to take great pleasure in the exposure of Claudius' guilt by theatrical means, relishing the self-referential potential of the scenario, exploring the multiple forms of drama capable of representing the same action, and filling the whole scene with London theatrical in-jokes. After all this, though, the exposure does not actually lead to the satisfaction of vengeance. Just after the play, Hamlet has a chance to kill Claudius and talks himself out of it. 2 scenes later he is shipped off to England, no questions asked. One can speculate on his reasons. To me, it seems almost as though the exposure, the catching of the king's conscience in the play, is fulfillment enough for Hamlet, who is at home in a realm of contemplation rather than action. He has had his revenge on Claudius' conscience, which is aptly demonstrated by the king's moving prayer soliloquy, and this is what counts for him. The body is simply a silly machine for Hamlet. The mind, the spirit, is where the action really is. Another strain that goes through Hamlet, and a disturbing one, is the abuse by Hamlet of his former beloved and his mother, Ophelia and Gertrude. In his scenes with Ophelia, Hamlet is relentlessly cruel, charging her with a lustful nature, a dishonest heart, a dissembling appearance, and so on. He builds up, in Scene 3, to an utterly misogynistic rant, beginning, "I have heard of your paintings well enough." Men in the English Renaissance were obsessed with women's makeup, which they took to be a symbol of feminine wiles, excuses, manipulations, artifices, and hypocrisies. Shakespeare, especially, has a long rhetorical history with this line of vitriol. It shows up in many of his plays and features strongly in his sonnets. Readers have long sympathized deeply with Ophelia's position in the play. As far back as 1765, Samuel Johnson wrote, "Plays the madman most, when he treats Ophelia with so much rudeness, which seems to be useless and wanton cruelty." Up to this point, Ophelia has been given few lines and hardly a will or mind of her own. She has done her father's will, her brother's will, and Hamlet's will. All three of the men in her life have defined her almost exclusively in terms of her sexuality and her beauty. Remember Laertes' parting instruction to Ophelia, that she should not open her chaste treasure to Hamlet? Here, throughout Act 3, is Hamlet's own iteration of the same patriarchal order, only now in a mocking, sarcastic, ghastly tone. The young and presumably innocent Ophelia is besieged and defined by fantasies of female lewdness, and she has little power to do anything about it. Hamlet's conduct with his mother is also probably repulsive to most readers. Their encounter in Scene 4 is full of even more ripe and fetid language of corrupt sexuality. Can you imagine saying to your parent, to your mother, nay, but to live in the rank sweat of an enseamed bed, stewed in corruption, honeying and making love over the nasty sty? This is ridiculously hurtful language, and seems motivated by something very deep and dark in our protagonist. Sigmund Freud claimed to have discovered the buried, primeval cause of Hamlet's flare-up in his Oedipal theory, his assertion that all little boys go through an original sexual drama in their childhood, in which they want to murder their fathers and possess their mothers. Ensuing scholars have questioned this theory, but this scene provides continuing fuel for speculation as to the exact nature of Hamlet's feelings toward his mother. Again, at the very least we can agree that he is here uselessly, excessively cruel. His cruelty toward both Ophelia and Gertrude seems at least as motivated by a deep-seated and virulent hatred of women as by the logic of the revenge plot. Act 3, then, gives us Hamlet as his most sublime in his meditations on death, and his most inexcusably depraved in his cruelty toward the women. Hamlet summary and analysis of Act 4. Summary. Scene 1. Immediately after Hamlet exits, dragging Polonius' body, we see Claudius asking Gertrude to explain what has happened. She tells him of Hamlet's accidental killing of Polonius, and Claudius realizes that he could have just as easily been slain. Claudius asks where Hamlet has gone, and Gertrude says that he has taken the body away. The king orders Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to find Hamlet and discover where he has taken Polonius' corpse. Scene 2. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern question Hamlet about Polonius' whereabouts. Hamlet evades their questions playfully, accusing his former friends of sycophancy to the king and leading them on a wild goose chase. Scene 3. Claudius is greatly distracted by the death of Polonius and the attempt to find the body. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern enter with Hamlet. Claudius questions Hamlet as to where he has taken Polonius. After some morbidly humorous replies, Hamlet reveals that he hid Polonius up the stairs into the lobby. The king sends attendants to find the body. Claudius then tells Hamlet that he is to depart immediately for England, as planned. Hamlet mockingly departs, leaving Claudius to reflect on his plans for Hamlet. He has prepared letters asking the English king, whom Denmark has recently defeated in war, to kill Hamlet as part of the duties owed by right of conquest. Scene 4. Next we see Fortinbras' Norwegian army. They are at the borders of Denmark. Fortinbras sends one of his captains to the court of Claudius to ask permission to cross Denmark in the course of their march to Poland. The captain travels on and Fortinbras and the rest of the army exit. The captain meets with Hamlet, who is being conveyed by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to the ship to England. Hamlet asks the captain about his army and his purpose in going to Poland. The captain says that in Poland there is a little patch of ground which Norway claims as her own. He describes this land as perfectly worthless and small. Hamlet suggests that the Poles will not likely defend such a piece of land, but the captain sets him straight, saying that Poland is already garrisoned and ready for their dispute. Hamlet wraps up his conversation with the captain. He hangs back from the others marching to the ship and delivers a long soliloquy on the irony of this occasion. These men are off to risk their lives for a worthless piece of land, while he, who has every reason to risk his life in the cause of revenge, delays and fails to act. Hamlet resolves to recast his mind to bloody thoughts. Ironically, however, just after making this resolution he continues on toward England, leaving Denmark behind him. Scene 5. Back in the court of Denmark, we see Gertrude speaking with a gentleman who explains that Ophelia has gone mad. She is rambling nonsensically about her father and insisting on seeing Gertrude. The queen reluctantly admits Ophelia, who proceeds to sing a number of simple and haunting songs, some of them quite bawdy. The king enters and witnesses her madness. Ophelia then speaks openly of her father's untimely demise and hasty, unofficial burial. She threatens, "My brother shall know of it," and exits. Claudius reflects on the difficulty of their situation, admitting that their decision to cover up Hamlet's deed and bury Polonius so covertly has gone against them. He says that Laertes has come from France, egged on by people who see the court as responsible for Polonius' death. On cue, a messenger arrives with word that Laertes has come to court with a mob of followers who wish to depose Claudius and make Laertes king. Laertes bursts in and tells his followers to wait outside. In a half-crazed state he insists that Claudius give him Polonius. Claudius attempts to calm Laertes and tells Gertrude to keep out of their talk and let Laertes question him to his heart's content. Claudius tells Laertes that Polonius is dead. He also insinuates that he and Laertes are on the same side, that he has been injured by Polonius' death too. Just as Claudius is about to explain what he means, Ophelia enters again, bearing a bundle of flowers. The sight of his insane sister deeply grieves Laertes. Ophelia handles all those present gifts of flowers, each symbolizing a reproach to the receiver. She sings another song about her dead father and exits abruptly. As she leaves, Claudius tells Laertes to inquire into the matter as deeply as he wishes, confident that he will find himself aligned with Claudius against Hamlet. Laertes agrees. Scene 6. A messenger approaches Horatio, saying that some sailors have news for him. Horatio receives from these sailors a letter from Hamlet. He reads the letter aloud. It recounts an amazing turn of events. On his way to England, pirates attacked Hamlet's ship. During the fray, Hamlet boarded the pirate vessel. The two ships parted with Hamlet still aboard. The pirates treated Hamlet like thieves of mercy, promising to return Hamlet to Denmark in return for some favors. Hamlet also alludes to a startling development having to do with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, but says that he must delay telling of this until they meet. He tells Horatio to follow the sailors to where he is hiding. Horatio says that he will help to deliver the rest of their letters, one of which is addressed to the king, and then go with them to see Hamlet. Scene 7. Claudius and Laertes are in conference. The king seems to have explained the strange occasion of Polonius' death to Laertes' satisfaction. He says that he did not try Hamlet for two reasons: first, because his mother loves him so much, and second, because the people of Denmark are supporters of Hamlet. A messenger arrives and delivers a letter to Claudius, who is greatly surprised to learn that the letter comes from Hamlet. The letter announces Hamlet's imminent return to court. With this in mind, Claudius and Laertes plot to find a means of killing Hamlet without upsetting Gertrude or the people. They propose to arrange a duel between Hamlet and Laertes, both of whom are accomplished swordsmen, though Laertes is the more reputed. Claudius suggests that Laertes be given a sharp sword while Hamlet's remains blunt. Laertes does him one better, saying that he will dip his sword in poison so that the least scratch will kill Hamlet. Claudius says that on top of this he will prepare a poisoned cup and give it to Hamlet during the fight. Gertrude enters with yet more tragic news. She says that Ophelia has drowned. She was watching Ophelia play in the branches of a willow by the water when she fell in. Gertrude says that Ophelia seemed ignorant of danger and went to her death slowly, singing songs. This news reignites Laertes' rage and Claudius goes to console him. Analysis: you can see simply from the quickness with which the scenes of Act 4 proceed that the action has reached a point of great tension following the death of Polonius. We see more evidence of Claudius' lack of political talent when we learn that he has simply hushed up Polonius' death, burying his longtime advisor without pomp or circumstance, and keeping the nature of the death a mystery. This, as much as the death itself, prompts the two events most central to Act 4, the return of Laertes and the madness of Ophelia. First, though, it's necessary to note that the fourth scene contains another of Hamlet's famous soliloquies, "How all occasions do inform against me." This speech reiterates, basically, the point that Hamlet made in his previous soliloquy about the actor playing Hecuba. The basic position of Hamlet is one of befuddlement that these soldiers can go off to their deaths over a patch of worthless ground while he, who has every reason to rage in war and battle Claudius, is introspective and melancholy, and chokes off his action with excessive contemplation. He remarks, "Rightly to be great is not to stir without great argument, but greatly to find quarrel in a straw when honor's at the stake." In other words, the greatness of man comes not with the greatness of an occasion, but with treating any occasion, however petty, as an occasion for greatness. One should not overthink, but do. Of course, this is not Hamlet's character at all, and as soon as he has resolved that his thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth, he is off to England, leaving revenge for another day, if ever. Indeed, Hamlet seems to express the central irony in his case: it is not enough that his thoughts be bloody. They already are bloody. What he needs, or what his father's spirit needs, is bloody deeds, not thoughts, and those are, as ever, beyond our protagonist. Laertes, though, provides precisely the model of what Hamlet is not. The early 20th century critic A.C. Bradley once illustrated Shakespeare's gift for characterization by observing that if Othello were in Hamlet's place the play would be about 30 minutes long. As soon as he learned of the murder, he would kill Claudius, and likewise if Hamlet were in Othello's he would immediately see through Iago's plottings and simply laugh the intrigue away. Just so, Laertes' vengeful return, like Fortinbras' military example, serves as a contrast to Hamlet's own hesitating, overthinking character. This is a true avenger. When he bursts into court demanding satisfaction, he says, "That drop of blood that's calm proclaims me bastard, cries cuckold to my father, brands the harlot even here between the chaste unsmirched brow of my true mother." In other words, Laertes proclaims that he has a bloodbound duty to avenge his father's death impetuously and bloodily, or else he proves himself not his father's son. In contrast, Hamlet has been calm, reflective, passive, playful, morbid, and impotent in his own long-delayed quest for revenge, a quest which has led rather to an attempt to find motivation to revenge, to reflect on the nature of revenge, the nature of man, and the nature of Hamlet. In short, Hamlet has thought and thought but has not acted. Laertes, we will see, acts without thinking. The other major event of this act is the madness of Ophelia. We have seen Ophelia, up to this point, represented as a chaste, innocent, obedient, bewildered little girl. With her madness, however, she suddenly has a deluge of lines and a rich, multi-layered, startling consciousness. The songs she sings are quite sexual, especially the one that begins, "Tomorrow is St. Valentine's Day." This ballad, which documents the duplicity of a man who promises to marry a young maid in order to get her into bed, and then abandons her because she relented to him, has been read by some as evidence that Ophelia herself gave up her virginity to Hamlet, who then left her in the lurch. In Kenneth Branagh's adaptation of Hamlet, for instance, the filmmaker explicitly shows flashbacks to Hamlet and Ophelia in bed. However, it may not be necessary to read the song, and the other songs, so straightforwardly. In her mad scenes, Ophelia is perhaps demonstrating the cultural pressures of a young woman of her time, forced into the impossible position of simultaneous chastity and sexualization. Ophelia, throughout the play, is forever urged to be chaste, be chaste, be chaste as in Laertes' instructions, or the get thee to a nunnery scene as a means of controlling her sexual identity. This emphasis on chastity contains, of course, the other side of the coin, a concern with lewdness. She must know nothing about sex, yet know enough to avoid it. In her madness, it seems as though Ophelia's inner dam, so to speak, has broken, and all of her contained knowledge of sexuality, and of the unfair position of women within her culture, has come rushing out. Ophelia's death by drowning is one of the famously impossible to settle questions of Hamlet. Did she die accidentally or did she commit suicide? If one looks forward to Act 5, it seems as though she was indeed a suicide. Given the immediate evidence of Gertrude's testimony, however, there is no reason at all to believe that she killed herself. Gertrude describes her as dying almost in slow motion, her clothes spread wide, and mermaid-like while they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old lauds, as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto that element. Indeed, the question to ask given this description is not, did Ophelia kill herself? But rather, if she had time to sing songs while dying, why on earth didn't Gertrude try to save her? Perhaps, though, Gertrude's narrative is an attempt to protect Ophelia. She knows that Ophelia is better off dead and tries to hide the fact of her suicide with her narrative. As with so many aspects of this play, the truth is not forthcoming. These shifts in meaning from act to act are difficult to pin down, but they serve to underline one of the most prevalent trends in the play, toward interpretive uncertainty. Any account of things in this play, whether the testimony of the ghost, the murmurings of Laertes' followers, or this eyewitness account of Gertrude's, leads to quite divergent interpretations. As Hamlet says in Act 2, here is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. If there is one lesson to take from Hamlet, it is this, that by our very nature we cannot ever know the truth, only interpretations of the truth. Hamlet summary and analysis of Act 5. Summary Scene 1. The final act begins with a conversation between two gravediggers as they dig Ophelia's grave. They repeat a rumor that Ophelia committed suicide and wonder whether she ought to be buried in hallowed ground. We learn that the king has overridden the objections of the clergy and provided for her burial. After some witty and macabre banter on the nature of grave-digging, Hamlet and Horatio enter. The main gravedigger sends his partner off for a cup of liquor and then commences to dig, singing songs all the while. Hamlet appears fascinated by the gravedigger's indifference to the gravity of his profession. As the gravedigger throws various skulls out of the grave, Hamlet wonders whom they might have belonged to in life, whether a courtier or a lawyer. Hamlet approaches the gravedigger and exchanges witticisms about this morbid work. The gravedigger informs Hamlet about the length of time it takes bodies to decay in the ground. He then produces a skull from the grave that he says has been lying there for 23 years. The gravedigger says that this is the skull of Yorick, the old king's jester. Hamlet is amazed. He knew Yorick and loved him as a child. He takes up the skull and speaks about Yorick, a topic that leads him to consider the nature of mortality more generally. A procession interrupts Hamlet's reveries. Claudius, Gertrude, and Laertes march toward the grave along with a priest and an entourage bearing a body. Hamlet notices that the burial is less elaborate than usual, signifying that the deceased was a suicide. He and Horatio stand aside while Laertes argues with the priest about the paltriness of the burial rites. In the course of his arguing with the priest, Laertes reveals to Hamlet that the dead body is that of Ophelia. Gertrude steps forward to say farewell to Ophelia. Laertes follows. In his intense grief, Laertes leaps into his sister's grave to hold her body again and orders the gravediggers to bury him alive. Provoked by this show of grief, Hamlet then reveals himself. After grappling with Laertes, Hamlet declares that he loved Ophelia more than 40,000 brothers could. The king and queen dismiss his avowal as madness. Hamlet then exits and Horatio follows him. After they have left, Claudius reminds Laertes of their plan to take care of Hamlet. Scene 2. Hamlet explains to Horatio what happened on his journey to England. He says that he strongly suspected Rosencrantz and Guildenstern of foul play, and so decided to apprehend their letter to England. In the letter he found an order for his death. Hamlet then devised a substitute letter asking for the deaths of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He happened to have a signet ring in the shape of the seal of Denmark, and so sealed the letter. Hamlet then replaced the letter while Rosencrantz and Guildenstern were asleep. At this point, pirates attacked the vessel, as related previously. A courtier, Osric, interrupts Hamlet and Horatio. In very ornate and silly language, Osric declares to Hamlet that Claudius has proposed a contest of swordsmanship between Laertes and he. Hamlet and Horatio mock Osric's pompous and artificial mannerisms. Eventually Hamlet agrees to enter the contest. When Horatio worries that Laertes is better at swordplay than he, Hamlet declares that he has been in continual practice for some time. A table is prepared and the king, queen and other figures of state gather to watch the sword fight. Hamlet begs Laertes' pardon both for his outburst at Ophelia's grave and for his rash killing of Polonius. Laertes appears to accept this apology but declares that his honor will not be satisfied until they have had their contest. Hamlet and Laertes choose their swords. Laertes nonchalantly chooses the unblunted sword with the envenomed blade. As they prepare to fight, Claudius proposes a drink to Hamlet. The fight begins with Osric as referee. Hamlet wins the first point and the king offers him a drink to refresh himself, dropping a poisoned pearl in the wine just before he hands it over. Hamlet declines to take the drink for the time being. They play another round and Hamlet again wins a point. After this second pass, Gertrude toasts to Hamlet's health. She takes up the poisoned chalice and has a drink despite Claudius' protestations. Hamlet and Laertes have a third pass which ends in a draw. After this pass, while Hamlet is unguarded, Laertes wounds Hamlet with the poisoned rapier. They scuffle and Hamlet ends up with Laertes' poisoned sword. He wounds Laertes with it. Just then, the queen collapses. She declares that she has been poisoned by the drink and then dies. Hamlet asks for the treachery to be found out and Laertes confesses the plan hatched by the king and he. He says that they are both inevitably going to die, having been wounded by the poisoned blade. Hamlet takes the envenomed sword and wounds Claudius, then forces the king to drink from his poisoned cup. Claudius dies. Laertes asks Hamlet's forgiveness and then also dies. Hamlet, knowing that he is about to die also, asks Horatio to explain this bloody spectacle to the confused onlookers. Horatio, on the contrary, wishes to die with his friend, but Hamlet convinces him to live a while and clear his name. Hamlet declares that Fortinbras should become king of Denmark. He then dies, the rest is silence. A flourish is heard and Osric brings news that Fortinbras has arrived from his victory in Poland with ambassadors from England. Fortinbras enters the court only to find 4 noble bodies sprawled out on the floor. The ambassadors from England enter with news that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern have been killed. Horatio explains that Claudius would not have welcomed this news even if he had been living to receive it. He orders that the royal bodies be taken up. Horatio further promises to explain the story behind the deaths, a story full of carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and forced cause. In short, he promises to tell the story of Hamlet. Fortinbras agrees to hear it. He adds that, given the death of the Danish royalty, he will now pursue his own claims to the throne. Finally, Fortinbras declares that Hamlet shall receive a soldier's burial. Some soldiers take up his body and bear it from the stage. Analysis: no surprise, this final act of Hamlet is as mysterious, ambiguous, and controversial as those of thought precedent. The play begins rather straightforwardly, if ironically, as a revenge tragedy. Old Hamlet's ghost spurs his son to revenge, and it would seem that Act 5, like the Act 5s of all major revenge tragedies preceding Hamlet, should fulfill this initial plotline. Indeed, in Act 5 Hamlet kills Claudius finally. But he does so in such a roundabout, half-cocked, offhand way, we wonder whether this really counts as revenge. The death of Claudius certainly lacks the poetic justice that vengeance seems to require. What on earth is Shakespeare trying to do with this strange play? Why doesn't he give it a proper ending? Many of the earliest extant critics of the play, those of the 17th and 18th centuries, found the strange and abrupt manner of Hamlet's revenge to be as puzzling as we might. These critics often found fault with the play's lack of moral meaning. After all, if Claudius was wrong to kill his brother and marry his brother's wife, shouldn't the lethal correction of these crimes feel more satisfying, more right, than it does in this play? Samuel Johnson, writing in 1765, voices critical dissatisfaction quite clearly. The poet is accused of having shown little regard to poetical justice, and may be charged with equal neglect of poetical probability. The apparition left the regions of the dead to little purpose. The revenge which he demands is not obtained but by the death of him that was required to take it, and the gratification which would arise from the destruction of an usurper and a murderer is abetted by the untimely death of Ophelia. In other words, Johnson charges that the ending of Hamlet is both unjust and improbable. The earlier part of the play, including the role of the ghost in giving the death of Claudius a moral shape, seems to have been forgotten. Hamlet seems to bring the drama to a close almost accidentally, and Johnson accuses Shakespeare on these grounds of dramatic clumsiness and moral ineptitude. Later critics have been much less quick to fault Shakespeare's dramatic instincts. Indeed, some of them have found the ending of Hamlet to signal a shift to a higher, more self-aware theater, a purposeful rejection of the simple morality of revenge in favor of a richer, deeper investigation of the nature of performance itself. The critic Harold Bloom, for instance, has written at length about Act 5 as Hamlet's rejection of his own dramatic role. He seems to have grown bored with his own play, in other words, and shrugs off its generic requirements. Bloom writes, any Fortinbras or Laertes could chop Claudius down. Hamlet knows he deserves the prime role in a cosmological drama, which Shakespeare was not quite ready to compose. In this view, Hamlet's final act transcends the play itself. The plot, the action, has only been an occasion for Hamlet's own tremendously powerful self-exploration, and the culmination of the requirements of revenge tragedy appropriately occurs almost despite the play itself. Shakespeare's abandonment of the central focus on revenge, then, perhaps amounts to his finally agreeing with his protagonist, so to speak. Hamlet has been, from the very first moments of the play, reluctant to carry out the absurd and generic task that is his as a character in a revenge tragedy. The time is out of joint. Oh, cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right. Shakespeare has purposefully miscast his hero and given us a character whose accomplishments are intellectual and verbal, not violent and physical. By the final act, it seems as though the playwright has finally given up trying to tie his hero down to conventions. Hamlet has forced Hamlet off the rails, taken it from a simple and predictable genre play to something inscrutable, massively significant, and, for lack of a better term, post-theatrical. Meanwhile, in between the two major events of Act 5, Shakespeare includes several very famous set pieces. The range of Hamlet's verbal and philosophical variety becomes clear as he goes from trading macabre jokes with the gravedigger, to his moving rumination on the dead court jester, Yorick, to his declaration of love for Ophelia and his attendant mockery of Laertes' over-the-top morning display, to a scathing parody of Osric's ludicrous courtly mannerisms. As noted before, Hamlet's mind seems to work as an intense magnifying glass of sorts. He looks at one subject, say, the gravedigger's macabre humor, and scrutinizes it to exhaustion before turning to another, say, the nature of mortality as occasioned by the discovery of Yorick's skull, and treating it with a similar thoroughness. The variety of his curiosity is matched by depth of penetration. He is both wide-ranging and profound, truly a Renaissance mind. In this final act, Hamlet seems no longer to curse this tendency of his to become distracted by thought in favor of action, as he does for instance in his soliloquies on Hecuba and on Fortinbras' army, but to celebrate it. He says to Horatio, for instance, when his friend seems concerned that he is walking into the trap set by Claudius and Laertes, "E defy augury. If it be now, 'tis not to come, if it be not to come, it will be now, if it be not now, yet it will come." The readiness is all. Hamlet rejects augury, that is, he rejects any predictive phenomena, or any future-oriented thinking at all. In a way, he rejects the ghost's order to fulfill a set goal. At any rate, Hamlet has achieved a point of philosophical quietus, an acceptance of the world with all of its flaws and absurdities, which he has made not with a bare bodkin but with his own mental powers. His gaze is focused on some spiritual realm beyond the pettiness of Danish political intrigue. Of the 4 deaths that occur in the final scene of the play, only one Hamlet's is planned. The other 3 are, if not senseless, at least spontaneous and chaotic. The entire gory episode seems to be a playing out of Hamlet's new understanding of the world. Death strikes randomly, senselessly, absurdly. The only meaning that matters must be made out of apparent meaninglessness. Hamlet's dying words, in fact, are a plea to his friend, Horatio, to help the court audience sort out the carnage that they have seen, and this harsh world draw thy breath in pain, to tell my story. Hamlet emphasizes that significance comes only in retrospect, with storytelling, with sense-making, not in prospective action. His death thus demonstrates the value of introspection over action, and the triumph of thought over fate, against the uncertainty and confusion of death. With the arrival of Fortinbras, the tone shifts dramatically in the other direction. Fortinbras, whose own barely limbed plot is extremely similar to Hamlet's, and nonetheless Hamlet's opposite. He is a man of action, a man like Laertes, or old Hamlet. As Hamlet predicts, he hardly wastes a moment in declaring his intention to take the throne of Denmark for his own. And, as a final irony, Fortinbras misunderstands the dead prince, and gives him a soldier's funeral. Though we know very little of him, it seems that Fortinbras is the anti-Hamlet, a man who can only understand others in light of his own simple and straightforward mind. Hamlet, because he was a prince, was probably a soldier, so he is given a soldier's burial. In an exact opposite way, Hamlet finds a universe of variety within his own mind. He explores the world from many perspectives, searches many questions, revolves all but resolves nothing. Fortinbras' arrival marks the end of the true reign of Hamlet, not Claudius' petty and incompetent rule, but Hamlet's regime of the mind and the possibilities of subjectivity. Important quotations explained. 1. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. Or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon 'gainst self-slaughter. O God! O God! How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Fie on't! Oh fie! 'Tis an unweeded garden, that grows to seed, things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. That it should come to this! But 2 months dead, nay, not so much, not 2, so excellent a king, that was, to this, Hyperion to a satyr, so loving to my mother, that he might not beteem the winds of heaven visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth! Must I remember? Why, she would hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on, and yet, within a month, let me not think on't, frailty, thy name is woman, a little month, or ere those shoes were old with which she followed my poor father's body like Niobe, all tears, why she, even she, O God! A beast that wants discourse of reason, would have mourned longer, married with mine uncle, my father's brother, but no more like my father than I to Hercules, within a month, ere yet the salt of most unrighteous tears had left the flushing in her galled eyes, she married, oh, most wicked speed, to post with such dexterity to incestuous sheets. It is not, nor it cannot come to good, but break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. This quotation, Hamlet's first important soliloquy, occurs in Act 1, Scene 2. Hamlet speaks these lines after enduring the unpleasant scene at Claudius and Gertrude's court, then being asked by his mother and stepfather not to return to his studies at Wittenberg but to remain in Denmark, presumably against his wishes. Here, Hamlet thinks for the first time about suicide, saying that the world is weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable. In other words, suicide seems like a desirable alternative to life in a painful world, but Hamlet feels that the option of suicide is closed to him because it is forbidden by religion. Hamlet then goes on to describe the causes of his pain, specifically his intense disgust at his mother's marriage to Claudius. He describes the haste of their marriage, noting that the shoes his mother wore to his father's funeral were not worn out before her marriage to Claudius. He compares Claudius to his father. As he runs through his description of their marriage, he touches upon the important motifs of misogyny, crying, frailty, thy name is woman. Incest, commenting that his mother moved at such dexterity to incestuous sheets, and the ominous omen the marriage represents for Denmark, that tea is not nor it cannot come to good. Each of these motifs recurs throughout the play. 2. Give thy thoughts no tongue, nor any unproportioned thought his act. Be thou familiar, but by no means vulgar. Those friends thou hast, and their adoption tried, grapple them unto thy soul with hoops of steel, but do not dull thy palm with entertainment of each new-hatched, unfledged comrade. Beware of entrance to a quarrel, but, being in, bear't that the opposed may beware of thee. Give every man thine ear, but few thy voice, take each man's censure, but reserve thy judgment. Costly thy habit as thy purse can buy, but not expressed in fancy, rich, not gaudy, for the apparel oft proclaims the man, and they in France of the best rank and station are most select and generous chief in that. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend. And borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow, as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. This famous bit of fatherly advice is spoken by Polonius to Laertes shortly before Laertes leaves for France, in Act 1, Scene 3. Polonius, who is bidding Laertes farewell, gives him this list of instructions about how to behave before he sends him on his way. His advice amounts to a list of clichés. Keep your thoughts to yourself, do not act rashly, treat people with familiarity but not excessively so, hold on to old friends and be slow to trust new friends, avoid fighting but fight boldly if it is unavoidable, be a good listener, accept criticism but do not be judgmental, maintain a proper appearance, do not borrow or lend money, and be true to yourself. This long list of quite normal fatherly advice emphasizes the regularity of Laertes' family life compared to Hamlet's, as well as contributing a somewhat stereotypical father-son encounter in the play's exploration of family relationships. It seems to indicate that Polonius loves his son, though that idea is complicated later in the play when he sends Reynaldo to spy on him. 3. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. This line is spoken by Marcellus in Act 1, Scene 4, as he and Horatio debate whether or not to follow Hamlet and the ghost into the dark night. The line refers both to the idea that the ghost is an ominous omen for Denmark and to the larger theme of the connection between the moral legitimacy of a ruler and the health of the state as a whole. The ghost is a visible symptom of the rottenness of Denmark created by Claudius's crime. For, I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom of exercises, and indeed, it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory, this most excellent canopy, the air, look you, this brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire, why, it appears no other thing to me than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason! How infinite in faculties! In form and moving, how express and admirable! In action how like an angel! In apprehension, how like a god! The beauty of the world! The paragon of animals! And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? In these lines, Hamlet speaks to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Act 2, Scene 2, explaining the melancholy that has afflicted him since his father's death. Perhaps moved by the presence of his former university companions, Hamlet essentially engages in a rhetorical exercise, building up an elaborate and glorified picture of the earth and humanity before declaring it all merely a quintessence of dust. He examines the earth, the air, and the sun, and rejects them as a sterile promontory and a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. He then describes human beings from several perspectives, each one adding to his glorification of them. Human beings' reason is noble, their faculties infinite, their forms and movements vast and admirable, their actions angelic, and their understanding godlike. But, to Hamlet, humankind is merely dust. This motif, an expression of his obsession with the physicality of death, recurs throughout the play, reaching its height in his speech over Yorick's skull. Finally, it is also telling that Hamlet makes humankind more impressive in apprehension than in action. Hamlet himself is more prone to apprehension than to action, which is why he delays so long before seeking his revenge on Claudius. 5. To be, or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache, and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to, 'tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream, aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause, there's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despot's love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would these fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of? Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment, with this regard, their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action. This soliloquy, probably the most famous speech in the English language, is spoken by Hamlet in Act 3, Scene I. His most logical and powerful examination of the theme of the moral legitimacy of suicide in an unbearably painful world, it touches on several of the other important themes of the play. Hamlet poses the problem of whether to commit suicide as a logical question, to be, or not to be, that is, to live or not to live. He then weighs the moral ramifications of living and dying. Is it nobler to suffer life, he slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, passively or to actively seek to end one's suffering? He compares death to sleep and thinks of the end to suffering, pain, and uncertainty it might bring, heartache, and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. Based on this metaphor, he decides that suicide is a desirable course of action, a consummation devoutly to be wished. But, as the religious word devoutly signifies, there is more to the question, namely, what will happen in the afterlife. Hamlet immediately realizes as much, and he reconfigures his metaphor of sleep to include the possibility of dreaming. He says that the dreams that may come in the sleep of death are daunting, that they must give us pause. He then decides that the uncertainty of the afterlife, which is intimately related to the theme of the difficulty of attaining truth in a spiritually ambiguous world, is essentially what prevents all of humanity from committing suicide to end the pain of life. He outlines a long list of the miseries of experience, ranging from lovesickness to hard work to political oppression, and asks who would choose to bear those miseries if he could bring himself peace with a knife, and he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? he answers himself again, saying no one would choose to live, except that the dread of something after death makes people submit to the suffering of their lives rather than go to another state of existence which might be even more miserable. The dread of the afterlife, Hamlet concludes, leads to excessive moral sensitivity that makes action impossible. Conscience does make cowards of us all. Thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. In this way, this speech connects many of the play's main themes, including the idea of suicide and death, the difficulty of knowing the truth in a spiritually ambiguous universe, and the connection between thought and action. In addition to its crucial thematic content, this speech is important for what it reveals about the quality of Hamlet's mind. His deeply passionate nature is complemented by a relentlessly logical intellect, which works furiously to find a solution to his misery. He has turned to religion and found it inadequate to help him either kill himself or resolve to kill Claudius. Here, he turns to a logical philosophical inquiry and finds it equally frustrating. Madness. Hamlet originally acts mad to fool people into think he is harmless while probing his father's death and Claudius's involvement. Early on, the bumbling Polonius says "Hoff this be madness, yet there is method in't." Polonius's assertion is ironic because he is right and wrong. Polonius falsely believes Hamlet's madness stems from Hamlet's love of Ophelia. To notice a method behind the crazy talk was impressive of Polonius. But as the play progresses, Hamlet's behavior becomes more erratic. His acting mad seems to cause Hamlet to lose his grip on reality. The circumstances he has to manage emotionally are difficult, to say the least. Succumbing to physical violence when under extreme stress shows that Hamlet has deeper set issues than merely acting mad. In reflection, Hamlet's choices and impulses beg the question, what gives him the right to act as such without consequences? Women. The presence of only two named female characters says something about the role of women within Hamlet. The death of both women also indicates a social commentary. Hamlet is at his most agitated state when talking to either female character. Although he cares for both, he's suspicious, as well. In the case of his mother, Gertrude, Hamlet feels she remarried too quickly and that her remarriage means she didn't love her first husband all that much. The idea freaks Hamlet out. Then there's Ophelia. From the way the characters talk, we know Hamlet has been wooing Ophelia for some time. But after Hamlet starts to act mad, it doesn't take long for him to assume that Ophelia is in cahoots with Gertrude, Claudius, and Polonius. In reality, Ophelia obeyed her father and her monarch. In both cases, Hamlet feels as if each woman has let him down, respectively. He's critical and quick to point out flaws through puns and backhanded comments. Ophelia is usually viewed as a true victim, while Gertrude's role is interpreted with more flexibility. In either case, the role and treatment of women in Hamlet is essential to discuss with an open mind.